The new Environment Minister horrified the Green lobby with his immediate dismissal of greenhouse gases as a primary agent of climate change. Have 2 weeks in office softened his views? Minister, first of all, congratulations on your elevation. We haven't seen you in Hearts and Minds since that. Brian Wilson, the Green MLA, said that you should base your comments on evidence, not uninformed babble. Have you, in the last 2 weeks, read yourself in?
And that's the problem, that a lot of the stuff about climate change and greenhouse gases, on which government policies are now based and which people in Northern Ireland pay through the nose for, is based just exactly on that. Babble, uninformed evidence, suppressing the evidence, not allowing those who do research and come up with different conclusions to have their papers published, having research budgets cut and everything else. And this whole industry which is growing around the environmental movement, where there is a vested interest, of course. You've got to, if you say there's no problem, you'll not get any money to research it. So they have sought to build it up. And of course, and this is the other thing, when they can't win the argument, then they either try to silence you by saying that you're talking nonsense, or indeed even worse, it's denial of climate change is almost like Holocaust denial.
But when you have the Interparliamentary panel on this saying that the most observed increase in globally average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic, otherwise man-made greenhouse gas concentrations.
Yes.
And that's pretty objective.
Yes, and don't forget the IPCC is also a body which is very, very political. It requires to get a lot of money for the research, which is, it gets...
Somebody always has to pay for research somehow, but this is an interparliamentary concept.
Yes, and it may well be, but it's politically driven. That's the first thing. Secondly, it has suppressed a lot of evidence. Thirdly, people who have taken a different view of it have been ostracised. And fourthly, many of the people who are on it are not even scientists who deal with mostly with climate change anywhere, or climate anyhow. In fact, many of them, there have been warnings given that some of them are making comments on things which are not even qualified.
Are you not politically driven?
Well, I'm politically driven in one way. I believe that when you're going to make policies which affect people's pocket, affect how much they pay for electricity, how much they pay for petrol, how much they pay for running their motor cars, how much they pay for going on their holidays. And don't forget, people's pockets are being hit in all of these ways in order to deal with the policies designed to reduce CO2 emissions. Then you've got to be very, very clear that what the policies that you're implementing have got some basis in evidence. And all I'm saying to you is this, Noel, that the scientific
But have you not made up your mind that the evidence presented to you is nonsense?
No, the scientific consensus is not there. There is climate change. The climate change has been happening throughout the history of the world. I can remember when I was at school, the only prize I ever won at school was for an essay on global cooling. And at that stage in the 1960s and 1970s, because since the Second World War, the climate had been, the Earth had been gradually cooling, and we were told we're heading for an ice age. Now we're told we're going to heat up. So, I mean, there's fads in all of this.
So although the Assembly has opted into the UK climate change bill, although there's a Kyoto agreements on reducing CO2 emissions, you're just not going to do anything to bring Northern Ireland further along that line.
I'll tell you what I'm going to, and I think that there's a sensible way around this. Obviously, we do need to look at the fuels that we use. There are good, sensible reasons for doing that. We know what has happened to the price of oil. We know the insecurity of the supply of oil and some of the fossil fuels that we use. We know that we need to have a range of energy alternatives so that we're not dependent on one particular source. Now, it makes good sense to have policies which at least give you a diverse range of energy sources. Now, if in turn that reduces CO2 emissions, if that's a consequence of it, well and good, but the policy should really be based on something which is sensible enough, such as security of supply. So I'm not saying that I would not be looking at ways of diversifying our energy, of ensuring that
But not with a primary objective of reducing CO2.
That is quite right. And the same when it comes to planning policies. When it comes to planning policies, I don't want to see the countryside that we have totally spoiled. So therefore you will look at planning policies and how you can maybe concentrate population in particular areas, reduce the impact on the environment, reduce the amount of travel
why instead
that
of
people have.
holding forth about muesli-eating, sandal-wearing, beatnik green fanatics, don't you use those people's interest in a cooperative way? Use their interest, use their knowledge, so that you can come up with the policies you're seeking?
Well, I think that the difficulty with many of those people is, of course, that they're so focused and so blinkered in their approach that really they find it difficult to look at the environment in a sensible way. And I suppose I was
So you say Friends of the Earth and the Green Party don't look at the environment in a sensible way. Is that what you're saying?
I suppose I was caricaturing them, just as they sought to caricature me. Now, there's no harm in that. And the very fact that you have now got me talking about the environment and we've raised this environmental issue maybe is because I used the kind of language which I did. But I would have grave reservations about many of the policies which they would seek to impose on people. And just let me finish this, Noel. And secondly, I think that they have got to realise that there's a world outside their little closed environmental world where people struggle to pay their bills every day. So therefore you can't impose on them, for example, huge rises in fuel costs to try and stop the consumption of petrol or diesel.
No one has to impose fuel cost increases. That's happening anyway.
Well, yes, but much of it, Noel, is down to the kinds of policies which the Friends of the Earth and the Green Lobby are encouraging the government to impose on people. So
they would deny that, of course.
Well, let me just look at it.
Let's just look at it. No, I need to move it on because we don't have that much time. You are a big fan of nuclear power. I understand. Now, does that mean that you will be encouraging the constituents of East Antrim to tender for the contracts the government is anxious to push out to look after, to take care of nuclear waste?
Well, I think that first of all, nuclear power is one of those alternatives. It's ironic that the people who most oppose nuclear power are the people who...
Would you build a station in East Antrim?
Well, let me finish the answer, please, would you? Most of the people who oppose nuclear power are also the people who jump up and down about the emissions of CO2. So they don't want you to generate electricity from using coal or using gas or using oil, but they don't want to generate.
To be fair, Minister, that wasn't
either.
the question I asked you, so I'm not stopping you answering the question. The question I asked you was, would you encourage East Antrim to take out a tender, to put in a tender to look after nuclear waste?
Well, I was making the point that, first of all, I support nuclear power, and therefore you've got, I was coming to the second point, you've got to deal with the waste. Now, the government has invited, and in its white paper, it has said that it would encourage councils to make bids for dealing with nuclear waste.
Would you encourage your constituents to make such bids?
All I'm saying is, if the geological conditions are right in parts of Northern Ireland, including my own constituency, and if the decision is made that, and if people believe that that is where you should locate it, and I don't know about the geological conditions, and there's a massive investment to be had, high-tech jobs to be had, then of course you would not rule out the option of having those jobs and having that investment, but you would also, of course, require that all of the safeguards which are necessary for storing that kind of waste material would be in place.
And what about having a station in East Antrim?
Well, if the geological conditions were correct in East Antrim and the option came for storing in Northern Ireland, I would certainly be saying, why don't we look at that?
But so we can look forward to this in your next manifesto.
Well, Noel, listen to the answer I'm giving you. If, and there are very few places in the United Kingdom where the geological conditions will be right. I don't know what the geological conditions are likely to be. I suspect that there will not be very many places in Northern Ireland where actually the geological conditions are correct. But if that were the case, then no area, I am sure, would want to rule it out immediately. And I look at what happens, for example, in Cumbria, where as a result of Sellafield, in an area where there's very little employment, there is massive investment and a large number of people employed, and people there live very comfortably with a big major employer.